welcome you all. EfoN welcomes you all with a special emphasis on its welcome note to Dr. Swetha Antony. Swetha Antony is, I'm pretty sure that she is well known to many of us who are here for her lecture. But still, for the sake of this formal lecture, a formal introduction is to be presented. And for that task, I find myself lucky enough. Initially, thank you, Shweta, for accepting the invitation of EfoN for delivering a lecture on academic reading and writing that would be of great help to our students and even for faculty members as well. We refresh ourselves with these lectures and talks. So, Dr. Swetha Antony is a generalist whose fingers are dipped in multiple fields of literature and humanities. She has a PhD in English literature from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. Her doctoral research work on the poetry of Kamala Das is broadly oriented towards post-colonial theory and literatures with a special focus on the language question and the theories of cosmopolitanism. The poetics of exile, as articulated by writers in the spectrum of new literatures in English, continues to fascinate her. She has forayed into the tantalizing area of food studies by co-editing with Elizabeth M. Smith the volume Beyond the Superficial, Making Sense of Food in Globalized World, published from Oxford Interdisciplinary Press, 2016. Her papers on Kamala Das and post-colonial literatures have been published in various edited volumes and journals. She is currently exploring the notion of third culture, third space in contemporary literature and popular culture by foraying into film studies, sports studies, and environmental humanities. Her ongoing research is on the larger impact of Portuguese colonialism and the origin and evolution of the Latin Catholic community in Kerala, which has led to her engagement with the relationship between art, literature, and environment. She is currently exploring the concept of Tanai to understand the presence of geographical spaces in the literary, cultural, and performative traditions of the coastal belt of South India. And it is already known to all of you that she is a faculty in the Department of English, University of Delhi. So, Dr. Swetha, I'm once again extending my warm thank unto you and request you to please initiate the session with the kind of approach you have toward academic reading and writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh, for that kind introduction. I'm honored to be a part of the session and more honored to be introduced by you. And a warm afternoon to each and every one of you who have joined the session today. It's indeed a pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces, and I look forward to a wonderful interaction with all of you. So before I start off my lecture on academic reading and writing, I would like to place on record my gratitude to Dr. Yogesh Kumar Dubey and the entire team of English for Nation for making this possible. Dr. Dubey's empowering endeavor at such a time of crisis is indeed heartening and is in fact an inspiration to go on in spite of all the challenges, professional and otherwise, that we have been facing since February of this year. Though the forum was initiated only in June, it has gone on to impact the field of English studies in India through the inaugural talks and the lecture series, all of which tackled events or aspects and discourses that are pertinent to the understanding of the current scenario. And some of those lectures had given us some practical ways of tackling the challenges in front of us. For me, what this forum represents is the spirit of camaraderie and the power of teamwork in making a difference, especially if you look at how the events have been collaborations with various institutions. Kudos to you, Dr. Dubey, and I hope that English for Nation Scale ever new horizons through its future endeavors. I'm honored to be a part of this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, let me move on to the task at hand, academic reading and writing. When Dr. Dubey approached me with the idea of a lecture that could be relevant to the larger academia, this seemed like an ideal topic. However, it is not bereft of challenges, even when it sounds so simple. I have to tell you that. And so, if you're looking at academia, for instance, especially if you're looking at English studies as a discipline, it is constantly shifting its contours and horizons. And in that case scenario, it's really difficult for us to pin down stuff, and especially when you are trying to define this act of academic writing and reading. So I go into my lecture with an anticipatory bail of sorts. As in, this is a sort of an unsteady ground, even for most of us who have been engaging with research for quite some time. And I'll tell you why. I want to kind of introduce you to the reason why I'm beginning with this conclusion. So, the broader context from which I approach this topic at hand will be based on two events, and uh, I I use the word winds of change to talk about those events. And these are, two events, winds of change, that have, in a way, shook the foundations of English studies. And let me begin with the first one. The first one is a global phenomenon which was set into motion in the second half of the 20th century, specifically in 1964, with the setting up of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, England, by two cultural theorists, Stuart Hall and Richard Hogarth. So, though the setting up of this center was a consequence of a large scale uprising across the globe by workers, by students, by women, uh, uh, to name a few, this move, in a way, redefined the discipline of English studies. Why, you would ask? Because with the initiation by Hall and Hogarth, what happened was that they contested the cultural elitism of criticism, and the primary approach of the center was the reconceptualization of popular culture as a site of resistance and negotiation for marginalized and disempowered groups. All right. In fact, what their question was, and I'm quoting an excerpt from Catherine Belsey's essay, Textual Analysis as a Research Method. So, what the sender did was to question the real tyranny exercised by the critical institutions, which secures its authority by exerting a strange hold on what is admissible as an interpretation. End quote. Even though there are issues with the levels of culture, with the tenets of cultural criticism, it revolutionized the way we do English studies by opening up a new field of inquiry, a new method or a new methodology of inquiry, which is historical, philosophical, sociological, and literary critical. And in other words, with the initiation of what we call cultural criticism, it is possible for a scholar in the English department to engage with, say, Shakespeare's Hamlet, uh, and perhaps Vishal Bharadwaj's adaptation of the same, Heather, the 2014 movie, and even today, because of the shift, we can look at the memes doing the rounds based on Hamlet's famous statement, to be or not to be. Right. And I recently encountered a meme which says that, it's not enough to say to be or not to be, but you need two A's. Right. So, what I'm trying to say here is that in a situation like this, where this whole hierarchy within criticism is dismantled, and where the binary set in motion by the distinction between low art and high art, or low culture and high culture, is being questioned, how do we then do research, or how do we kind of tackle the multiplicities that is before us, or the pluralities of meanings before us? Or in other words, with cultural criticism, the idea that was foregrounded was that there are as many readings or interpretation as there are readers of a text. And bang, because of all that, we are now in the era of post-truth, wherein we say that there is no single truth, but only multiplicities or variations of what we see or what we take as truths. So that is the first wind of change. Now, the second wind of change. Uh, the second wind of change is actually contextualized within the Indian scene, and quite a recent event. The new educational policy, which was launched on 29th July 2020, it was optimized to the current needs, and it aims at regenerating and revigorating the education sector in India by 2035. Like in a decades, in 10 years time or 15 years time, what this policy envisages is a sort of dismantling and a regeneration of the whole education sector, right from primary education onwards. And the implication of this policy on higher education sector is immense. And why am I talking about this now? Because if you look at the features of the new education policy, NEP as we call it, it is aimed at teaching for sustainable future. What it highlights are aspects such as skill development, interdisciplinarity, multi-transdisciplinarity, and flexibility. And I believe the endeavors of English for Nation imbibe the spirit of NEP 2020. And since we are on winds of change, because I'm a literature person by training, I cannot help but refer to this very famous conversation between Sherlock Holmes and his companion, John H. Watson. So when I say Sherlock and when I say winds of change, I'm sure that you guys will be reminded of BBC's Sherlock, and this very famous statement, "The East Wind is coming." Right? I'm sure that you guys can remember that. Yeah. So yes, there is an east wind coming, and I'm not referring to Cumberbatch's version here, but I'm going back to good old Arthur Don Coyle, where he says, or the conversation as he envisages between Sherlock and John H. Watson. So I'm just reading it out. "There is an east wind coming all the same. Such a wind as never blew on England yet. It will be cold and bitter, Watson, and a good many of us may wither before its blast. But it's God's own wind, nonetheless, and a cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm has cleared." So, though the east wind has conventionally been associated with destruction, what the quote stresses on is a purging and a possible redemption. And when I discuss the various aspects of academic reading and writing in the contemporary academic space, I hope to touch upon ways of surviving these winds of change, of being resilient of this east wind. Now, with that, let's begin from the basics. So, what is academic reading and writing? So, when you're looking at this title itself, what comes to the fore is this presence of the epithet academic to the acts of reading and writing. So what we are positing here is that it's a unique kind of activity, as in we are reading and writing with a certain purpose in mind, unlike, say, reading or writing for pleasure or during your leisure. At the outset, we will have to understand the differences, and what I'll do now is to highlight a few features that helps one to say that this is an academic text. First and foremost, the first thing that strikes you is this particular style of writing, a particular format, which is largely formal to semi-formal, the use of certain types of words, certain kinds of words, certain vocabulary, or what we call jargons, words that are specific to a discipline. And you will see that it's often engaging with one central idea, logically developed through elaboration, illustrations, and through arguments. And so hence it's largely an expository text, unlike a literary text or a journalistic piece of writing. And it often deals with a concept and very clearly establishes a cause-effect relationship, and to a large extent foregrounds a perspective, right? And it employs this methodology of constantly authenticating facts and information by quoting external sources. So if there are if there is a presence of external sources or reference to other critics, essays, etc., then you can say that this is an academic writing. And also it is often aimed at a particular audience, and most importantly, it is an intellectual activity. It is an intellectual activity that wants us to evoke certain skills within us, and largely it is the cognitive skills, like as in you cannot engage with with the acts of academic reading and writing without acknowledging that you have to bring in certain skill sets to the whole act. Now let me kind of look at the skill sets, right? So um, so what are these skill sets? We are bringing in a different set of skills to these activities. As in, when we are reading and writing academically, we are bringing in different cognitive skills, or basically, as far as skills are concerned, the most important ones seems to be the acts of reflecting, processing, and developing a perspective. And in that sense, we have to look at these two verbs, that is to read and to write, as transitive verbs. I'm sure that you know the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs, right? So any verb is an action word, and it's often categorized into transitive and intransitive. Let me elaborate on this a bit more. So I'm looking at this idea of how read and write within academic writing, or within literary research, is tends more to be towards the transitive verb side. And why is that, or why am I saying that? A transitive verb, as you all know, is one that only makes sense if it exerts its action on an object. All right, so it needs an object to assert itself, right? So a verb that is often accompanied by a direct object, it links the action taken up by the subject with uh, the object upon which that action is taken on. So if you're, let me elaborate on this with examples. So if you're looking at transitive verbs, for instance, to send is a transitive verb, to prepare is a transitive verb. So I'll give you examples. Alex send a postcard. So if you just say Alex send, it doesn't make sense. You have to bring in the object, that is a postcard, to make a sense of the action of Alex. All right. And also, he prepared lunch for us. So if you just say he prepared, it doesn't convey the importance of the action prepare, right? But you need an object after prepared, right? But if you're looking at, say, intransitive verbs, to give you examples, she fell, we flew, right? You don't need an object to elaborate on the action fall or fly, right? But when you're looking at transitive verbs, it's important that there is a sort of a relationship between the object, the action verb, and the subject, right? And now I am kind of taking that forward into the larger context of literary research, and how the acts of reading and writing are involved in a dialogic relationship between the object and the subject. And from this vantage point, how do we define the importance of these action verbs to literary research? All right. So let's now try to answer that by looking at the constituents here. So what are the constituents here, or what is the object here? Object within literary research. An object is most in most case scenario, or the obvious object before us is a text. And if we go by the classical tradition of criticism as initiated by Plato and Aristotle and all, you will see that a text is predicated on the production of a conjectural author. Or in other words, let's just say a text is written by X. So we often look at text from that perspective as written by someone. So sometimes what happens is that someone is more important for us than the text. All right. So the object here is any text. Now, who is the subject here? Is the subject the researcher? So that is the question. All right. Is the subject here the researcher? I'm not answering that question right now. I'll kind of come to that answer in a while. So is my question here is the researcher the subject here? All right, in this act of reading and writing. Then let's assume this. Academic reading and writing is nothing but the researcher engaging in the acts of reflecting, processing, and developing a perspective. All right. But since there are those west winds looming over the researcher, it's not simple as that. Remember the two west winds that I told you about, right? So because of the presence of those west winds, it's not possible for us to kind of conclude that the researcher is the subject here. Now, why do I say that? Let me explain that by engaging a bit with the first wind of change. Remember the larger shift within English studies as a discipline globally that was brought in by a series of events in the middle of the 20th century, right? And in the plethora of events that came about, the most prominent one were the publication of three essays, to be more precise. So, among the intellectual movements of the mid 20th century, structuralism, structuralism, the rise of Frankfurt School, Marxist criticism, etc. Apart from all that, uh, uh, there the entry of three essays into the intellectual scene in a way shifted our shifted this whole idea of world as we knew it, or literary world or literary research as we knew it. And the essays that I'm referring to are first The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, published in 1967, Writing and Difference by Jacques Derrida, published in 1967, and What is an Author by Michel Foucault, published in 1969, which is often considered as a rejoinder to Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. So even if you are not familiar with all these texts, you can understand from the title itself that it is talking about that major shift within the English studies, or within the discipline, within the intellectual discipline in a way, wherein these critics are going on to proclaim are going on to kind of revolutionize our entire existence by saying that there is no author and there is only text, right? And this thought in a way went against this whole idea of, or the whole institution of criticism that was predicated on the role played by the author. And to some extent, if you look at the classical approach to criticism, it always sees the critic as an alibi of author and the author as an alibi of the critic. So in that sense, if you're looking at what we are doing today, we are not undertaking the role of a critic. We are all researchers, and there is a difference between these two terms. So I'll go into that by elaborating on how these three essays in a way influenced our situatedness today. So, and what these theorists did was to question an understanding of text, and suddenly a text is something or anything which constitutes the inscription of a culture. All right. So it's no longer the the property of the author or the authorial presence or the conjectural author, but it became a site of interactions. It became a site where culture became inscribed. And let me read out a portion from Barth's essay, The Death of the Author. Please listen to this. A text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. So hold on to these words. So a text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not was either not was hitherto said the author. So the shift towards the reader, and the reader is the space. So let listen to how he defines the reader also. The reader is the space. So reader is not a person. The reader is a space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin but in its destination. So this is again one of those most quoted lines from this essay. A text unity lies not in its origin but in its destination. Yet this destination cannot any longer be personal. Why? Because the reader is not a person, the reader is a space. So this destination cannot any longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. All right. So I hope you got an idea of how this text kind of shifted our understanding of the act of interpretation itself. So let me now move on to what Catherine Belsey takes forward from this excerpt, or this redefining of the relationship between the text, the author, and the reader. And in her essay, Textual Analysis is a Research Method, she says, or she talks about this reader or the ideal addressee as an utopian figure. Because how can you find a space that, or a reader, without history, biography, or psychology? So that's an impossibility, right? So and therein lies the fault with Barthes to some extent, and that is the reason why structuralism pays way to post-structuralism. Uh, and yeah, so coming back to Belsey, so what Belsey takes forward from Barthes' essay is this idea of this ideal addressee or the ideal reader, and she calls that reader the utopian, an utopian figure. Why? Because the Barthes reader is the ideal addressee of the work, the representative of all those whose interpretations the institution has excluded. And interpretation attends to all the quotations that make up the text, the traces by which it is constituted. All right. So Barthes talks about a series of traces, but what Belsey is talking about is a sort of a series of traces that goes into the act of interpretation itself. So let me clarify this with an example, right? So you are familiar with Shakespeare's Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. This is published between 1599 and 1601. So it's largely in the context of, say, Renaissance Europe in that sense. And I don't know whether you are familiar with this adaptation of Hamlet that came out in 2000, in which Ethan Hawke is playing the role of Hamlet. But surprisingly, Ethan Hawke is not like Hamlet in, this is Michael Almeredia's version or adaptation of Hamlet. Incidentally, in this version, Hamlet is not a prince. Hamlet is a filmmaker. All right. And so if you have not seen the one with Ethan Hawke as Hamlet, let me take you to our own Heather, Vishal Bharadwaj's Heather, which came out in the year 2014. And you know the larger context from which it is, larger context or setting of the movie. It's happening in Jammu and Kashmir. It's set in Jammu and Kashmir. So if you're looking at the idea of text, and if you're looking at the idea of Hamlet as a text, how do you then come to terms with all these Hamlets, right? So so that is where this utopian figure comes into play, or that's where this utopian figure, as posited by Belsey, comes into or becomes useful. not the way in which you would look at the ideal addressee, the way Barth also talks about, right? Because we are looking at a series of texts and intertexts. And when we are looking at Belsey's version of this utopian figure, we are then reminded not of the ideal addressee or the ideal reader, but of a researcher, right? So, so now, so when you're reading these three Hamlets, for instance, you're in fact reading the readings brought in by Shakespeare in 1600 Europe, Michael Almerda in 2000 Los Angeles, and Vishal Bharadwaj in 2014 India. So we are kind of looking at different perspective or different contexts, different historical epochs, different realities, different situatedness, etc. But it's all Hamlet, right? So we now know from the discussion so far how to look at text, or what a text is, and who an ideal addressee is as posited by Barth. But is the ideal addressee the researcher? So that is the question that we have to address. I would say from my experience, no. Why? Because the researcher is someone who engages in a dialogue with the dialogue between the text and the ideal addressee. All right. So remember, Barth talks about this dialogue that happens, wherein when he posits that the text is a destination, the dialogue between the text and the reader or the ideal addressee. But the dialogue that we are engaging with is in fact a bit, thrice removed from that dialogue in a way. So, for instance, we as, or I as a researcher, or all of us as researchers are engaging in a dialogue with the dialogue between the text and the ideal addressee in each epoch. So if you're looking at Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, then you are in a way engaging with how that text talked to the ideal addressee as posited by Hamlet, or the ideal addressee in that context would be someone living in at the end of the 16th century, right, and who is familiar with what's happening in Denmark, right? Whereas if you are engaging with Heather, you have to engage with a different set of realities altogether, right? And you are, so when you are as a researcher looking at the evolution of Hamlet, you are in a way engaging in dialogues with multiple dialogues. So in that sense, let me just come to one conclusion. A researcher in such a tricky scenario can never be a critic. All right, a critic, because that seems to be the popular notion that a researcher is someone who does criticism. No, because a critic is a sort of an alibi of the author, and is essentially part of a established hierarchical system instituted by the early classical models of criticism. So we are not doing criticism anymore. So what are we then doing? So if you uh, or in other words, in the present scenario, we cannot call ourselves critics, because if you are positing that a researcher is a critic, then that reading itself will be at fault, as like I've told you, a critique is an alibi of the conjectural author. And when you are giving a sort of a centrality to the author, what you are negating is the existence of the ideal addressee and the existence of the notion of text as an entity comprising of iterations in the text, all of which point to the fact that a text is a site where a particular culture operates, and not something that is merely conjectured by the author, right? So as researchers, we have to understand that we are working against the hierarchy in place by in set in place by the institution of criticism, wherein they talk about a logocentric attempt at meaning making. In the present scenario, in the post-truth era, we are looking at not the author or the conjectural author, but we are looking at the text. And the text here becomes a site where culture gets inscribed. And a text is not a sort of a monolithic in any sense of the term. A text is a space where, or text comprises of iterations and intertexts. And as a researcher, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is this fact that there is no thing as pure reading, and also the fact that interpretation always involves extra textual knowledge. And uh, so so now that we have come to that conclusion, how do we, the next question before us is, how do we then draw the lines concerning which is the correct reading while writing an academic paper? A very practical answer. So it's a question that doesn't have a definite answer, but according to me, or from my experience, the most practical answer to that question as to where do we draw a line when there are multiple meanings before us. So what do we call as research in that sense, or how do we go about it practically? And Catherine Belsey, in her essay Textual Analysis is a Research Method, uh, points out practical ways of doing that, or gives us a sort of reassurance when she redefines what research is in the era following the impact of cultural criticism and the era of post-truth. And I quote her here: research is expected to make a contribution to knowledge. It uncovers something new. Research is supposed to be original, quote unquote, in the sense that it is independent. So, what she's saying, or how she's qualifying research as original, is by using independent instead of original, right? So, research is supposed to be original in the sense that it is independent. The contribution, whatever it is, originates in that fairly modest sense with the researcher. If it does not have to be original in the much more daunting sense that it springs fully armed from the head of the researcher without reference to any previous account. On the contrary, in fact, it is much more likely to involve assembling ideas that have not been brought together in quite the way before. And it does not have to shift the paradigm. The contribution can be quite small, a piece of the jigsaw, but research is required to make a difference to the standard account of a topic, whatever that topic might be. So, what we have to take forward or imbibe from what she points out is this idea of how originality within research depends largely leans towards the independent research done by a researcher, and research, original research in a way involves assembling ideas. It need not have to bring in a sort of a revolution in the sense of shifting paradigms altogether. You can just add a new piece to the whole jigsaw. So what she is asking us to do is to make a difference by deviating from a standard account of a topic, right? And one of the things that she talks about, or warns us about, are aspects like such as pure subjectivism. So, for the sake of being novel, or for the sake of bringing in independence, or for the sake of bringing in newness to research, can we then go on and bring in a subjective interpretation? That's not research, right? So, pure subjectivism is not the thing to do. Paraphrasing, right? So paraphrasing, not in the way in which we look at it, but if you are saying that, or if your reading of Heather is it's a sort of a very broad, or if your academic paper on Heather, Vishal Bharadwaj's Heather is centered on this whole idea of a comparison between how Shakespeare presents Hamlet and Bharadwaj presents Hamlet. That's just a sort of a paraphrasing, according to Belsey. And the next thing that she talks about is free association. All right, so to be or not to be question. So it's important that all these Hamlets should go through this to be or not to be question, and they're facing the same crisis in a way. But that's not the case. So if your research paper about the journey of Hamlet is focusing on these aspects, which are the given to any reader, then uh, uh, according to Belsey, it's not research. You are not kind of bringing in anything new. You are not assembling ideas in a new way, because whatever you are talking about are merely the standard account of a topic. So no matter how much work has gone into a topic, for instance, you can contribute something to the understanding of text by deviating from a fixed pattern that has been established within the reception, as far as the reception of that text is concerned. Now, what is another practical way out? And what Belsey suggests is an intense textual analysis, wherein you focus more on the primary source. Yes, of course, she says that secondary sources are important, but what she asks us to do, because she says that it is the independent researcher who will bring about a shift in the understanding of the text. So, our situatedness, our body of knowledge, our engagement with texts, with critics, our culture, the culture that we are situated in, the family background from which we are coming, our situatedness, or each one's situatedness as a researcher in a particular set of experiential reality is the thing to focus on. So when you read a primary text, or when you begin with an intense engagement, textual analysis of the primary text, the text itself invites you to new interpretations, right? Yes, of course, I don't mean to say that depending on secondary sources is not important. It is important. It does in a way help us to understand the range of interpretations that have gone into the understanding of text in each epoch. So that historical understanding is important. Secondary sources do come into play, but one thing that we have to remember is that the secondary sources should not in any sense replace your own understanding of the text, or the secondary sources should not in a sense influence you or entice you into believing them. So you have to constantly question them, right, and come up with your own understanding or your own analysis of the primary source, and perhaps then go to the secondary sources to understand how your own argument is contributing to the legacy of the discourse on, say, Hamlet, for instance. So, according to Belsey, the way out begins with an intense textual analysis where you adopt a critical vocabulary which allows the text to invite certain readings and offers specific positions to the addressee. And the best way to go about it would be to engage, or in a way kind of engage in a dialogue with the ideal addressees in each epoch, in terms of looking at it from a historical perspective, or what we call as literary historiography. So that's one way of looking at it. But what I would like to end on, perhaps, is this idea of minding the gap. All right, I guess when I uh, so when I say mind the gap, I'm sure that for most of you who are in Delhi, it's a Delhi Metro message that comes to your mind. Yeah, the mind the gap between yeah, the metro and the platform, right? So there is this very small gap. So I would use that analogy to talk about what how we go about it, right? So the as a researcher, perhaps the original research that you will be bringing to the table would be that small gap, right? Uh, but there are two sides to it, or the way I see it. So you are constantly told to mind the gap, right? And you know that there is a gap. But if you are in a way taunted by that message, and you just assume, or you just decide that you're not going to exit the metro cabin, right? Then what happens? You don't experience the gap, right? So there are two sides to it, of course. So you know the gap, you know that you have to mind the gap, but if that knowledge about the gap and the fact that you have to mind the gap is stopping you from taking the plunge, then you're not the good researcher. You have to take the plunge knowing that there is a gap, and there might be chances where you might fall into the gap or slip into the gap. So that's something that we have to work with. But personally, I would take the jump, and even if I plunge into the gap, I'm ready to kind of plunge into the gap, even without in a way staying back, right? So I'll stop on that note. So please mind the gap.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, ma'am.
Uh, Thank you, Shweta. It was really very, very interesting, very much engaging, and the kind of examples you brought that were really very interesting. That made your whole lecture much interesting. It starts
Thank
from
you.
example, from grammar, verb, and the division of verb in transit and intransitive verb, and then we come to metro. For a long time, we have been divided of metro.
Yeah, yeah. So we
Uh,
are missing the
very
gap, right?
Yeah, yeah, obviously.
Yeah,
And very beautifully, you made a distinction between researcher and critic.
yeah.
What
That's
is a
crucial.
research? Yeah, what is a research work? The basic thing you have told that research is not reading and interpretation, but addition of new knowledge. You appear to be like T.S. Eliot
Wow.
when he says that a poet is the last link in the tradition of that
Yeah,
poetry
true,
writing.
true,
Okay.
true.
So really quite interesting and mesmerizing. It was really very interesting. Now, may I invite the audience for any question, query, comment?